The Italian Renaissance, which is the field I study, is filled with artists and discoveries that deserve our attention. So I decided I should refine our selection for today. And to do this, I took the advice of Herman Melville, who long ago said very emphatically, "To produce a great book, you must choose a mighty theme." Well, Michelangelo is certainly a mighty artist, and the theme of sacred and profane in his work was the subject of some of his greatest works of art. The distinction between these contrasting opposites of sacred and profane seems to be in our DNA. It's inscribed in our most ancient literature on the creation, the story of the Garden of Eden in Genesis. The Garden of Eden was a sacred enclosure in which God walked and conversed with Adam and Eve. When they were expelled from the garden, it was paradise lost. They entered the mortal world where the rest of us are for a life of hardship and death. But they preserved their dignity, and that's one of the key questions of Western culture, and also in Michelangelo's art. The word profane does not mean profanity. It means not sacred. It means secular, of the world. We also say for sacred and profane, we say heaven and earth, immortal and immortal, spiritual and sensual. I'm going to concentrate on how Michelangelo represented this timeless distinction. But first I want to show you how ancient and how universal it is. Take us back 4,500 years ago. Peoples whose identity is still disputed spent at least 50 years constructing Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a circle of enormous stone obelisks that are so configured that on June 21st, the summer solstice at dawn, as we see here, it shines through both sides of them. And the winter solstice of December 21st is also calculated. It's a giant sundial. It is assumed by everyone, because theories abound as to what they thought they were doing, that this was a sacred place. But we only knew the half of it. 5 years ago, we learned, to archaeologists' astonishment, that Stonehenge had a lost twin only half a mile away, of which no visible trace remains. They only found it by looking with scanners below the surface of the earth and finding the pits where the timber pillars were arranged in a mirror of Stonehenge. So while Stonehenge of stone stood on the hill, indomitable, its perfect circle, meaning there's no end to it in terms of time, it continues forever, the timber reflection of it stood there and decayed like a contemporary work of conceptual art on the subject of sacred and profane, a beautiful emblem, beautiful in its truth, of mortality. The Garden of Eden was a very important subject in the Florentine Renaissance, thanks to its depiction in these frescoes, which were made 50 years before Michelangelo's birth in 1475, and it's known he studied here. And they were divided by two painters, Masolino, who painted us in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. They're looking serene, they're feeling good. Masolino had a delicate, elegant style, so they decided you should paint that. And for the expulsion, Masaccio took the brush and he painted our ancestors taking on full fleshiness and entering this vale of tears. Here is the sacred and profane represented through his youth. As a young man of 17, he was a guest inside the house of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, and he talked to the philosophers there, and it's recorded that one of them, named Politian, gave him advice on his early work, which is this one, which is the Battle of the Centaurs. Well, this is as impressive an example of any work of art ever made of the brutal consequences of letting your senses run unchecked and wild. It shows the Centaurs of Thessaly, who are half men, half horses, having invaded the wedding party of their unfortunate neighbors, the Lapiths, and becoming drunk and growing lustful and launching a murderous brawl. So now we have anger, lust, and drunkenness in this one work. He shows Michelangelo, the sculptor, how we are all reduced, everyone participating into this, into the raw matter out of which the sculpture itself is carved. They actually club each other with chunks of rock that look like each other's heads. And it's a brilliant exposition of a pure profanity. A great interest for Michelangelo was trying to discover the secret of this artist, Donatello, who was a previous generation for him, because Donatello was the first artist who could emulate the beauty of classical statuary. And this statue of David was the first full-length male nude sculpture made in Italy since antique times. It stood in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici. When 17-year-old Michelangelo went in and out, he walked by this. And he learned to emulate its sense of beauty, but he did not emulate its sense of the sensual allure, because sacredness has an elevation, a detachment from our senses of understanding, and the physical beauty by itself can appeal to our senses. This was the great trap everyone was urged to avoid. He made in 1494, just at age 19, this crucifix for the Santo Spirito monastery in Florence, and I was standing there in the sacristy. The photograph on the left side shows how it's to be seen in the church. It's in a quiet sacristy at one side, and past me walked a white-robed old priest who I believe was the prior, and seeing me study it, he said to me, "It's very Augustinian, you know." And were I of a more humble make, I would have nodded with appreciation, but to my regret, I immediately responded, "I know." Lo so. However, not so snidely. I was quite happy he had said that, because what I was realizing at the time was he was emulating the philosophy of the historical founder of that convent, St. Augustine, who said that what matters is the ultimate truth of God and not the slings and arrows of mortal passion and destruction. It's a beauty of a sacred kind, and contemplating this human beauty can elevate our contemplation to the beauty of heaven. Here is a statement by St. Augustine that is so applicable to this early crucifix by Michelangelo. God is beautiful, beautiful in heaven and on earth, beautiful in the arms of his parents, beautiful in leaving this life and taking it. On the strength of these successes, Michelangelo was called to Rome. He was still not yet 25, and he was assigned an important commission by Cardinal Riario, who wanted to have a statue of Bacchus to put in his courtyard and to also perform theatrical productions around it. And Michelangelo took the theme and he made a human being worthy of the beauty of the god Bacchus, or Dionysius in the Greek tradition. At the right, I show you a drawing that shows the proportions, according to Michelangelo, of a beautiful male nude, and he sculpted it with great skill. Bacchus is drunk. He passed most of his time inebriated, the sources tell us. And so he's shown, better than any previous sculpture, teetering under the dizziness of being drunk. Look at his face. He's seized by this inebriation. And the problem was, Michelangelo had not respected the convention of showing the antique gods with respect. It's too profane for the cardinal to put in his courtyard. The work was rejected. It was left out in the rain and sun for 50 years before the Medici Duke rescued it and took it back to Florence. Here as his companion, in case we missed the point of Bacchus, it's a little satyr, half boy, half goat, who's gobbling down the fermented grapes unrestrainedly. He suffered a terrible career reversal in not understanding that the gods were not to be shown in all their profanity. He was redeemed, fortunately, with his performance in this purely sacred sculpture, the Pietà in St. Peter's. He worked on this sculpture for 2 years, 1 year sculpting it, and then, which no one else had ever done, he had taken the care to acquire the purest statuary marble from the Carrara quarries. He spent another full year polishing it. I always feel that anything that a Michelangelo would spend a year polishing would turn out looking like nothing else anyone else had ever made, which was a condition of his contract. And look at the beauty of the Pietà. The purity of Mary and the serenity of her son were used by him as attributes of their divinity. Now there is a profane kind of beauty, as I showed you with the Bacchus, and in women, he exercised this most clearly in this drawing he made as a gift to a brilliant young man, Tommaso Cavalieri, and he gave him this drawing of Cleopatra. And Cleopatra was reputed to have the beauty of Venus, so he's idolized her in the, let's say, most elegant way he could imagine. But there is some tip-off, such as the fact that her braid of hair turns into the serpent that bites her. And the serpent, of course, even makes us think of the temptation in the Garden of Eden. Her beauty was such that she conquered her two Roman conquerors, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. On the back of this drawing, he placed a warning. Here is the warning which says, attention, beauty's only skin deep. The unchecked temptations of the beauty, seductive beauties of Cleopatra only mask this banshee-like creature below the surface. Don't cast yourself into the pit with her. We unfortunately don't have young Cavalieri's response to this sober warning he received, but the work is treasured today. He had an active career as an architect, and more than any other architect, and very differently from our approach today, Michelangelo used one approach for his sacred architecture and a different approach for his profane. I'll start with the latter. When called upon to make fortifications for the city walls of Florence, he drew inspiration from reptiles, spiders, and crabs. At right, I show you, you can just barely make it out, there is a drawing of a crab by him. And this aerial view of a bastion, it looks like pincers on the fortification, intended also to scare the people. And what it meant was that the anger and fury involved in war had to do with our human instincts, not our divine. And this is another such drawing. You really can see the ribs and the carapace of this crustacean-like bastion, and those lines streaming out of it that look like spitting venom are in fact the firing lines to show where the guns would be hidden beside. In his sacred architecture, in addition to the dome of St. Peter's that everyone knows and admires, we have this extraordinary drawing. It was never executed. Many of his best plans were never executed. They were too particular, I think, too peculiar to him. But this beautiful design for the Church of the Florentines in Rome, which is called San Giovanni dei Fiorentini, is based on the perfect symmetry of the Greek cross. The two arms of the cross are identical, and then to achieve a circle, he turns it 45 degrees, and we have at an angle another Greek cross that makes an X. The ambulatory is the circle that we have seen of eternity, and the lines that he traces between the chapels and the altars seem to emanate with a kind of spiritual power. It is a most impressive sacred architecture. The X and that line there that go into a chapel have been read by many scholars as the Greek letters, chi and rho, and this symbol, such as I sketched it, I'm taking credit for my PowerPoint prowess now, is found in the catacombs. It's the first two letters in Greek of Christos, Christ. Which brings us full circle. Stonehenge was built by mortal hands, by men who were attempting to create an instrument to allow them to understand the heavens better. Their monument still stands, so they did a magnificent job. Michelangelo left and created all these works that lead to our deeper understanding of heaven and earth. Thank you.